Today we're going to be discussing Parsha Toldot. We're well known that here is where both Yaakov and Esav are born. If one looks at the Parsha, there's a very interesting verse with an interesting word, the way it's written. I'm just going to read it out, of course, just to make everyone aware what's going on. So this is after Rivka becomes pregnant, and she has a lot of difficulty with the pregnancy. There's some seems to be inner turmoil within, and so she goes to ask a prophet. In that time, Shem was a prophet. She goes to ask what's going on, and within the prophecy of Shem, she's told that basically she has twins inside of her, and that's why there's this conflict, because each of the two children have a different nature, and it starts to talk like this. We'll get into the psukim now. It says, "Vayitrotetzu abanim b'kirba, vatomer im ken lama ze anochi." There was this inner turmoil, this ritza. The commentaries discuss what the implications are. One midrash discusses that when she would pass a beis medrash, so she would feel a pull, like the baby inside pulling to go to the beis medrash. When she passed a house of idol worship, a pull inside, to go to the house of idol worship, and she asked herself, "How could I have what's going on? What's inside of me?" And so she was confused, and she went to seek out advice from Shem, and it says, "Vatelech lidrosh et Hashem." Okay, to ask what Hashem will tell her about this. Now this is the main verse we want to get involved with. Okay, Vayomer Hashem la. God says to her, of course, through Shem as a prophet. Now here's where it gets interesting. There's a concept in the Torah called a ketiv and a kri, or kri ketiv, however it works out. That translates, there's the written word, and then there's the way we read the word. And of course, 99.9% of the time, the way the word is written is the way it's read, and there's no issues. But on rare occasion, the Torah, with a specific intention, writes a word spelled one way, but instead of having you read it that way, it has it read another way. And this is part of the oral tradition. It's explained, obviously, most of this is, it's a tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu, or, the rabbis learn these things out. Also, this is part of the way that the Torah is nidreshet, that there's a kri and a ketiv. So we know that there's a reason for it. It's not just by chance that the word's written one way and meant to be pronounced another way, but there's deep implications. And as we'll see in other cases, you see how it comes out, that the rabbis learn out many different ideas from the concept of a kri and ketiv. So here's where one shows up, and it says that Vayomer Hashem la, to Shnei, the ketiv, the written word is geim, two proud ones is how that translates. Two proud ones, bivitnech, are in your stomach. And the ketiv, that's the ketiv, the geim, proud ones. But it's read goyim, two nations are in your stomach. And the verse continues, Ushnei leumim mime'ayich yiparedu, and two regimes will separate from within you. And each regime will fight to gain strength over the other, and in the end, v'rav ya'avod sa'ir, the older will serve the younger. Okay, this is the context of what's going on over here. Now we want to appreciate the message behind this ketiv and the kri. Why the Torah specifically chooses here to write the word which spells out and means two proud ones. Yet we're meant to read. When we read the Torah, we don't read proud ones. We read two nations. So Rashi is a very, very well-known Rashi. He comes in and he discusses this, and he really is bringing us from the rabbis a very interesting, peculiar concept. On the surface, it doesn't seem to make much sense. But let's start with Rashi's comments on this issue. So Rashi writes that the reference that the reason why it was written two proud ones, again the word proud, at the same time it's a reference to two nations, because we know that both Yaakov and Esav became two separate nations. So he says here, is a hint to what's going to happen many, many, many years in the future. There was a time period in history where the Roman Emperor Antoninus was friends with the Jewish leader Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. They befriended each other, they respected each other, And they were both very wealthy, and they were both represented this concept of leadership. And so Rashi tells us on this verse that the mention of two proud ones that are from two nations is a future reference to the descendants of course, Yaakov and Esav, many, many years in the future, thousands of years in the future, that they were proud and they were wealthy, and the rabbis continue to discuss that. It's interesting that the history explains that we're taught that here Antoninus respected Rabbi, and actually they call him even a student of Rabbi. He went and learned from Rabbi secretly, and that's a very unique situation which we're going to explore more later on in the discussion. But anyway, that's the starting point. Rashi comes to us and explains that the written and the audible words here of nations and proud ones is a reference to them. On this point, the Chatam Sofer has in his commentary a very also well-known discussion about it. He raises issue on this Rashi and says, how could we come to explain, let's take things in a simple sense. What's going on over here? Rivka comes to Shem to ask her, what's going on inside of me? I have, this inner conflict. If I'm having a baby, what kind of baby am I having? I asked to have a baby, and this is what I'm having. So she wants to know from Hashem what's the situation. So Shem, as a Navi, says that you have, again, let's go with the written verse. He says to her, you have twins basically, and they're both proud ones, and they're going to separate and become two nations. That's what he tells her. Now, he explains, Chatam Sofer, that it seems a little bit far-fetched for us to think about and appreciate that Shem is telling Rivka about Antoninus and Rebbe, which are not going to be for thousands of years. So, l'chora, on the simple level of how this story took place, as far as what Shem said to Rivka, probably most likely there was no discussion of Antoninus and Rebbe. So the question comes up, first of all, then why did the rabbis explain this verse in that way? But more importantly, to our discussion, why does Rashi include this discussion of the rabbis in his commentary? The commentary of Rashi has a unique, specific agenda. He wasn't one of the rabbis that collected all of the different, unique, interesting sayings from the rabbis. For that, we have midrashim. We have plenty of midrashim, and Rashi knows that a student of Torah will eventually turn to the midrashim and will learn about all of the different ways of appreciating what happened. You have very beautiful midrashim that, when they talk about the brothers of Yosef coming to Yosef, the Torah records a very small amount of discussion between them, and the midrashim add all these different details of how each of the brothers was powerful and they showed their might, and it's very very, very interesting to see how much information the rabbis bring out. And so Rashi knows that we will eventually come to the Midrash and know all this. So the question really is, first off, what are the rabbis trying to accomplish by telling us that this is a reference to Antoninus and Rabbi? But more so, we want to know why Rashi is this explaining it in his commentary, which he himself says in the very beginning of his discussions, that I've only come to explain the simple meaning of the text. So the real difficulty is on Rashi. How is it that Rashi means to say that his explanation of that this reference of proud ones and nations is to two people that will be born many, many, thousands of years later? That's the issue we're going to address right now. So on that point, we have to know, first of all, both Esav and Yaakov represent the root, the shoresh, of all of their future offspring. So, in the simplest sense, the fact that Antoninus is a descendant of Esav and Rebbe is a descendant of Yaakov, then in a very broad sense, there is some type of shaychut, there is some kind of connection over here. That the Chatam Sofer accepts, everyone would accept. But it's still very difficult to say that this has anything to do with the nevuah of Shem, the prophecy of Shem, and what he says to Rivka. But we can make it a little bit more connected based on what the Kabbalists say. So it's brought in different Sfarim. I think Megala Amukot, one of the very deep Sfarim, says that really Antoninos was a reincarnation of Esav to some degree, and Rabbi also represented to some degree a reincarnation of Yaakov. So with that in mind, it becomes more tight. The connection is stronger because then it's really them, so to speak. It's not just some one that was born, many, many generations after, but that's one way to appreciate and strengthen the connection between the two. So, but we want to go a little bit deeper because that still would not be a reason for Rashi to use this commentary. So what's the depth of this commentary? So the Chatam Sofer really opens up the real depth of the commentary and explains really what the sages understood in this verse and why they explain the way they explain. And once we appreciate what the sages understood, then we'll know why Rashi chose to put it in his comments. So he explains that in the very beginning, when Yaakov and Esav were conceived, when they were still in the womb, so the potential for these two brothers were to remain brothers. Now, it's true that they each had a different nature. They weren't identical in essence, and they didn't have the same characteristics, the same character types. They weren't born to be a carbon copy of each other. They were born to be two different people with two different roles in life, two different natures that were meant to be explored and developed. But everyone that Hashem makes, especially here in this case, both Esav and Yaakov, had a divine purpose. Now, with this in mind, in the Hasidic commentaries, they explain, much later on in the story, we're going to see that Yitzchak wants to give Esav a blessing. And everybody is shocked. And how can Yitzchak, the righteous Yitzchak, want to give Esav, who is utterly wicked, a blessing? So in one of the comments mentioned that Yitzchak was not foolish, as the simple, superficial reading of the text would imply. Yitzchak understood that Esav wasn't perfect. But he understood that with the power of his blessing, it would give Esav the power, perhaps, to overcome his inclination and turn to the good path. That's one way of explaining why Yitzchak wanted to give the bracha to Esav. And with that in mind, it really supports what we're saying, that in essence, from their conception, they both had a divine purpose. What were their divine purpose? So, the Torah tells us clearly that Yaakov was a simple, pure, wholehearted, truthful person that sat in the tents of Torah. Yaakov was a man of Torah. He was, in essence, meant to be spiritual. Okay? His job was to sanctify himself and the world through Torah observance and Torah study. What was Esav's role? So the verse describing Esav calls it a man of the field, ish sadeh, man of the field. What does that mean? So in a positive sense, a man of the field is what we call later on, when the Jewish nation becomes a nation, we define people that their main role was to go out and work in the field. We call them the Amah and Amei Haaretz, the people of the land. And their job was to work the field and develop produce, to have food to eat, to survive. So in essence, Esav was more physical, and his role was to cultivate the physical. But what is the ultimate purpose of the cultivation of the physical world and the utilizing this world? It's not meant for its own sake. Ultimately, we know that physical and spiritual have to work together. Without a body, the soul cannot do nothing. Without a soul, a body can't do anything. The two come together and have to work together. And that's what really Esav and Yaakov represent, really the idea of physical and spiritual, and body and soul. And so Yaakov's role was the role of ruchaniyut, spirituality, and Esav's role was physicality. We can see this interesting combination. Just take any school that exists today, any yeshiva that exists today. So you can have great rabbis that give the best, lectures, the best shiurim, but the students need to eat, students need to sleep, The students, need to be taken care of physically as well. And there's a tremendous amount of financial burden on any Torah establishment to survive. So we see that a Torah establishment is not only about the classes given. The class needs a table, chairs, air conditioning if it's hot in the summer, food. We feed the students very well these days, Baruch Hashem. So any type of place that wants to succeed, a synagogue, a Bet Knesset, you know how much the expense of a Bet Knesset is? The rabbi gives a beautiful drasha every Friday night, but much more than that is necessary for a shul to function. So we see that you need both spiritual kochot, but you also need physical ability. And this is really what the rabbis tell us in the Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, that if there's no kemach, if there's no flour, which is where we make bread from, and you could say that the hint to saying kemach is to hint to the beginning process of bread. They could have said simply, if there's no bread, there's no Torah, which is what it really means. But they didn't say bread, they said kemach, because where does kemach come from? Kemach is something that's a result of grinding wheat. Where does wheat come from? Wheat comes from the field. So we can suggest that the rabbis want to further emphasize the work involved in producing bread by mentioning kemach. They could have said wheat, but we're not going to get into too many details. If ain't kemach, if there's no kemach, if there's no wheat, if flour, if there's no way to make bread and to survive physically, then ain't Torah, then there can be no Torah. So in essence, the combination of being Esav and Yaakov as brothers, as twins, was essentially, in order to have Esav, man of the field, he was supposed to provide the physical sustenance to Yaakov. And Yaakov was going to be the man of the tent, the man of Torah, and he would provide the spiritual sustenance to Esav. Two brothers working together in harmony, fulfilling the purpose of creation. Each one needing the other, bringing the world to perfection. And that is the essence of what Esav and Yaakov represented when they were in the womb. This is exactly what the Chatam Sofer explains. And with this in mind, he goes further to say, with this we can appreciate why Esav comes out first. And he explains that when it comes to Torah learning and support of Torah learning, so the supporters of Torah learning, they have a precedent. They come first when it comes to honor. Because, and it's very logical, without their support, the Torah scholar cannot learn to the same capacity. So, and the person that's working is actually physically working and providing the necessary material, money needed for the Torah student and for the yeshiva to function. Without money, there can be no yeshiva, ultimately. And in this world, it's a physical world, and in this world, the physical aspect of things is the main thing. Like we say, the action is the most important thing because we live in a physical world. So the support of Torah is so important that when someone supports Torah, so he is supposed to be honored. And we honor the Torah supporters tremendously. And the Torah scholar himself has an obligation to honor the Torah scholar. And his honor comes before the honor of the Torah scholar himself. That's what the Chatam Sofer explains. And he brings an example from the Mishkan and the Mikdash, from the menorah and the bread. That the bread was placed in a position that teaches us that it comes first, because bread represents physical support. And the menorah, which represents the light of Torah, comes second, in kavod, in honor. So he explains based on that Yaakov understood that Esav's role is to support me. So he said, Esav, you're going to support me, then you go out first. All the honor is yours. You're going to sacrifice in this world and work hard to support Torah and our people. So you go first. You get the honor. Honor is all yours. And that's how he explains why he let him go out first. But there's a problem with that. Is afterwards, Yaakov takes his hand and holds on to his heel. So based on this, he explains the reason for that is because when Yaakov saw the way Esav left the womb like a savage, and it's explained that almost instantaneously when he left the womb, the evil inclination, the Samach Mem, the Yetzer Hara, the angel of Esav came and possessed him, and he became really what we call a wicked person from the beginning. And when Yaakov saw that, he said, wait a minute, Esav's not going to do his role, so then he doesn't have the right to go first. So he put his hand out to show his objection to his going and coming out first. That's the way the Chatam Sofer explains it. And with this in mind, we can take a look at the pasuk and appreciate the beautiful depth that is here. In the very beginning, it's true, we have two different children that are going to go in two opposite directions, which is very true. Physical and spiritual are two opposites. However, if Esav would have accepted his role, his divinely ordained role to harness the physical world and his physical powers and talents for the sake of goodness, for the sake of truth, for the sake of Torah, as a brother to Yaakov, then they would have been in harmony. And that's the way we read it. Vayomer Hashem la. Shem is telling to Rivka, you have two diametrically opposed children in your womb. But don't worry. The fact that you see this inner conflict, it's not a problem. Because what you have is you have Shnei Geim inside of you. You have two uniquely proud individuals. One that is going to aspire to greatness in Torah. He's going to be the Torah teacher. And another one who is going to be a man of the field. He's going to be a established, successful, strong person that's going to provide physical sustenance and protection. He's going to be a strong man in the physical sense and proud with those qualities, as long as he, of course, has the yoke of heaven upon him and he accepts the following of the general way of Torah and he has himself appreciates Torah. You're going to have two proud twins. They're going to be like a left and a right hand working together as one unit, one people. And that was the potential, to be two proud ones. We don't mention the word nation, we mention just proud ones. The written word over here is proud. Each one will be proud of his fulfilling his own purpose, and Hashem will be happy with both of them. However, we know the reality is that the evil inclination took over Esav from the time he was born. So the pasuk continues. This is really, we're talking about now, but if they won't unify, then you'll have the result of the pasuk, two nations that are going to separate, two entities that are going to fight for power, fight for control. That's going to be the result. If we don't have the harmony, then we have the separation and the conflict and the war between physical and spiritual, Esav and Yaakov. And that's where the word goyim comes in. The kri, the way we read the pasuk, is goyim. Because since Esav did not fulfill his part of that role, so from the word goyim, two proud ones, it reversed to become two nations. Instead of being two proud ones of one nation, they became two separate nations because Esav rejected his divinely ordained purpose. Here we see a beautiful insight in the concept of the written word and the read and the way we read the word. The written word, which is the way Hashem told Moshe to write the Torah, represents what Hashem had in mind, so to speak, the potential. The potential was for them to be two nations, two proud people of one nation. But the way we read it, which is the way the human being comes and reads Hashem's Torah, is already emphasizes and hints towards man's involvement and how the Torah ultimately and what's going to happen is a combination of man trying to aspire to do the will of Hashem. And there is where there's room for change because there's free choice ultimately. And so the Kri tells us Goyim, two nations, because although in essence there was potential to be one nation, but through the choice of Esav, it was split to two nations. So the insight of the written and the word and the way the word is read, it tells us about the potential and the actualizing of potential. That's the deeper message here. So now what do? Unfortunately, we became two nations, enemy nations. But interestingly enough, so when was this fulfilled? The real nevuah of Shem. What did Shem say to Rivka, according to the way we're learning it? He said to her, you have two proud ones in your womb. He didn't read the word goyim and explain it to mean Antoninos and Rabbi. The way he read it was, you have two proud ones, that's Esav and Yaakov, and they're going to help each other and work together. And if they don't help each other and work together, then they'll become enemies. They'll split to two regimes, two powers fighting with each other for control. But interestingly enough, one time in the history of mankind, the fulfillment of the expression of the two proud ones working together, helping each other, happened. When? Thousands of years later, Esav and Yaakov, according to Kabbalah, were reincarnated. Or we say that future descendants, which are of course connected, were born and were friends and respected each other. And Antoninos respected the Torah and the honor of Torah, and he gave Rabbi honor, and he made himself into his student. And Rabbi respected, of course, Antoninus and his role of power and authority, and they respected each other, and they helped each other, and they worked together, and there was kavod haTorah, and the purpose there was truth and Torah. So one time in the history of mankind, there were two proud ones from these two nations fulfilling the prophecy of Shem, and including, though, the word goyim, because since Esav rejected and became a separate nation, the two proud ones had to be expressed working together through different nations. And that happened once in the history of mankind. What's the deeper message for us? Once we see that the nations of the world are not fulfilling their role, they're not supporting Torah learning, they're not providing the necessary means for Am Yisrael, for the nation of Israel, to thrive and to be the spiritual conduit to bring blessing to the entire world, as it's taught from the rabbis. The rabbis tell us a very extreme statement. If the nations of the world would know how beneficial the Beis HaMikdash was, and our service in the Beis HaMikdash, and the sacrifices that we offered, if they would have known how beneficial it was to them, they would guard it themselves from destruction. You have today the United Nations. And, if the United Nations understood how beneficial a Beis HaMikdash would be, they would themselves lend all their armies. The different countries would lend their top commandos to come and guard Israel from harm, so that we could pray for the world, because our real job is to pray for the world, for the betterment of all mankind, to be a light unto the nations. And so the nations realized that they would be on our side. They don't realize it. And unfortunately, that's why we're alone in this battle. Now, as a result of Esav's rejection of his role, Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, has to be self-sufficient. We have to become both the spiritual power and the physical power. Where do we see this? We see this with the advent of the partnership of Yisachar and Zevulun. There's no one going to come help, so we have to help ourselves. And this can be understood in two ways. The way we see today, you have Balabatim that support Torah establishments, and you have rabbis that are teaching the classes. But even a single individual himself has to realize he may himself combine both facets. A person can be devoted to Torah learning, but at the same time support his learning and other Torah learning. So we have to, Am Yisrael became now a unit that is self-sufficient, in that we have to provide for our physical sustenance, and we have to provide for our spiritual sustenance. And that's the new role. Since the rejection of Esav, that's the role of Am Yisrael. And we see a beautiful accomplishment through this. Because if we take another look at the Beis HaMikdash and how it was set up, what do we see in the Kodesh? We see a lamp of light. Everyone can appreciate that light is spiritual and light represents divine wisdom, beautiful. But why do we have to bring our bread in the Kodesh? Why should we bring bread into the holy? What's so holy about bread? Bread comes in the field. Animals eat from the field. The physical part of us needs the bread. Why should the bread be brought into the Kodesh? I understand I need bread to survive, but it shouldn't be in Kodesh. It should be out of the Kodesh, where it belongs. It comes from the field, leave it in the field. But we see a deeper insight, and that is when we, the Jewish people, utilize the physical world, when we succeed in sustaining ourselves, and we do all that koach, all that energy to support truth, to support Torah, then the physical work we do in the field itself becomes holy. And through knowing a person's purpose and utilizing his physical talents and powers in the physical world, in the business world, but when he himself is devoted to Torah observance and Torah learning, or he is supporting Torah learning and Torah observance, then his life also becomes holy by way of extension. And to the point where we don't say, oh, okay, you did a good thing. No, we bring the bread side by side with the menorah, because without that bread, there's no menorah. So they're equally kadosh. And it represents the higher level of sanctifying the physical life of the Jew. And this we can learn from the pasuk. It's very beautiful. Later on in the story between Yaakov and Esav, Yaakov comes to get the bracha from Yitzchak, and Yitzchak touches his arm and says, I hear the voice of Yaakov, but I feel the hands of Esav. Now, according to the way we've explained everything until now, this itself is symbolic and represents the fusion of both the physical purpose and spiritual purpose. Meaning that since Esav rejected his role, Yaakov has to be both the hands of Esav, which is a man of the field. Yaakov is going to have to work in the field to support, but he also has to be the voice of Yaakov, the voice of Torah learning and the voice of prayer. And so it all is going to come through Yaakov. That is the symbolism of the statement of Yitzchak to Yaakov. He's saying, I understand and I see now, although I wanted to bless Esav, but I understand that no, ultimately it's all going to come through Am Yisrael. You're going to have to be self-sufficient, Yaakov. You're going to have to be both the hands of Esav and the voice of Yaakov. And when the voice of Yaakov is for Torah, then the hands of Esav are also holy. And that's why the bread is in the Kodesh. And just to conclude with an interesting point, whenever there's the completion of a Gemara, of a Masechet, of Talmud, so we say that, we have a good portion. We were Amel, we work hard, and they work hard. We work hard and we have a reward. They work hard and they have no reward. The simple way to understand that statement, the contrast between those that learn Torah and have a reward, and those that don't have a reward, is simply the Jewish nation that was given Torah and the non-Jews that don't have Torah, the other nations that rejected the Torah. But we can go deeper. We can go within, because ultimately we have to just look within. There's no point to look outward. Within Am Yisrael, there are two choices. When a person is born with more of a physical nature, he has two choices. He can go into this physical world and get lost in there and amass a fortune and forget his purpose, forget why he's even in this world. And he ends up buying all the different toys that the world offers. Boats, cars, planes, trains, automobiles, everything. He just, on a power trip. Or he can remember his purpose. He can go into the world and become a successful businessman and understand that all that money and all that power is a tool to use for the will, to do the will of Hashem and to support goodness and to support truth and to support Torah. So we could appreciate it this way. When we, at the conclusion of a Masechet of Gemara, right, which represents our Torah, what are we saying? We're saying we toiled and we have a reward. They toiled and they have no reward. Who could we be referring to? We're referring to us. Why? Because I couldn't finish this Gemara without the support. So Torah ultimately needs physical support. So we're saying together, both the scholars and those that support scholarship, together through our amelis, through our toil, the scholar in the learning of the book, but the other person for supporting, facilitating the learning to take place. We both toiled. You toiled in the field, I toiled in the base measures, but we both toiled for the sake of Hashem. We both have a reward. But he, our fellow Jew, who goes out and toils and keeps it all for himself and gets lost with his purpose and decides to just feed his child personality within, and just amasses a bunch of toys. He toils and he has no reward because he didn't use the physical. He didn't succeed in bringing the kemach and turning it into bread and bringing it into the Kodesh. His bread stayed in the field because he stayed a behema. He didn't sanctify himself for his life. So the way we're saying it now, it's all about the amelis, the toil that we do, that we're going to reward from, is not just the toil of Torah only. Those that toil in the world but support Torah, they have an equal reward in this amelis. So anu amelim is not just me that finished the Gemara. It's also the person that supported that the yeshiva has lights and tables and chairs and food and air conditioning. He did amelis. He did amelis in his place, and we both have equal reward. But the one who takes the physical blessings that Hashem gives them and uses them selfishly, he loses his reward. And that's the point we have to understand. That we conclude.